r/AskReddit. Posted BYU triggered liberals. Ex-prisoners of Reddit, who was the most evil person there, and what did they do that was so bad? Not sure about most evil but interesting story. When I did time I was bunked up with a guy who had stabbed his uncle to death, molested him. Guy was insanely mean, but when lockup came, he was super nice to me. He was 23 but couldn't read or write, so we would dictate letters to his girlfriend and I would write them for him. At least you had a good enough heart to help him out, props to you. When my dad went to jail he was shocked by how many young men couldn't read or write. He made a lot of important friends because he was one of the few people able to help with legal paperwork. This quiet Chinese guy on the wing allegedly found out his wife was cheating with a friend of his, killed the wife and fed her to said friend. When I was in the outbox the day before I was released I was hanging out with a bunch of guys just killing time. One of them was part of a muddy killing gang. They kidnapped and killed a bunch of people for body parts, and cut them off while the people were alive. It was a pretty gruesome case. Anyways, he was really quiet and rather stupid. Just a simple farm boy type. Why did they want the body parts? Probably organs trafficking, I would say. There was a correctional officer at least 6'5" and well built, and he would always come in pissed off. So one morning we are waiting in line for breakfast and he thought he heard this older man call him a bitch. He followed the man back to his cell and started teeing off on him. The man didn't even try fighting back, and when he fell the first time he split his head open on the steel bunk. The inmate was so out of it he started asking where his car keys and wallet went while he was on the ground bleeding. The CO hears the man and for some reason turns around and goes back and hits him a few more times and says, "Who's the bitch now?" I'll never forget thinking, damn, this is somebody's father. They're probably both somebody's father. English guy here. I spent 4.5 months in prison in 2018. There was a guy who was really nice, seemed like a genuine guy. That was until I found out he strangled his drunk wife to death and left her there whilst he went to work the next morning. Ah, the killing your wife and going to work like nothing is wrong thing. Years ago, husband trained a guy in his company and the guy forgot their assigned iPad one day. He told him to go home and get it. The guy went home, stepped over his wife's dead body in the kitchen to grab his iPad and returned back to work. About a week later my husband came home and told me what they had found out when the police came in to ask them timeline questions and more right before he was arrested. He killed her before work, was hoping that his alibi would be, "I was at work all day on base, I couldn't have done it." He made some critical mistakes, he would have been caught either way, but proof that he went home when her body was already laying there dead was another nail in the coffin for him. You've got to save those PTO days, man. You don't burn them up just because you murdered your wife. I was locked up with Jodi Arias, so that was bizarre. There was also a woman who murdered her baby and kept it in the freezer. We called her Maytag. This is awkward. This rich kid stabbed his friend in the chest, killing him, but he was on Xanax and weed at the time and doesn't remember anything of it other than his friend on the floor dying. The mad thing is this guy, 18 years old, actually got off with the murder and found not guilty, although was sent down for just under 2 years for possession of a knife. His parents were quite wealthy and it was a big case in the UK. Basically his barristers were the best money could buy and he said that's how he got off. Edit, he didn't have any remorse for his actions, which was made to think made him a pretty fucked up person. It's a funny one though because he actually seemed a nice guy until he would talk about the killing and just didn't care what he had done. Nobody else in the prison had ever killed anyone to my knowledge, as it was a lower cat prison, but he was only there for possession of a knife. Edit again, I didn't expect people to know the persons involved in this or as many responses. I am currently still on license, meaning I still have to report to the probation service and don't particularly want any blowback for mentioning this and can never be too careful. If anyone has any questions, PM me, as I'm not answering specifics on a public forum. I know it's anonymous but just not worth the risk. Sorry. Wild story. I can understand him not remembering due to him being on drugs, but the no remorse part really threw me for a loop. My mom was in prison for 12 years. She knew a girl in federal in Phoenix, Arizona who had decapitated her husband, kept his head in a cooler in the boot of her car, and then proceeded to take a road trip with their 4 kids with his head in the back. I was in JDC, not DOC, but most of the people in JDC were locked up for the same reason as some people would be in DOC. I remember talking to this kid and he was kind of stupid in the head. I asked him what he did and he raped his 10-year-old sister while she was asleep. Most of them were in there for murder, but he stood out since he was a sex offender. I worked with a lot of juvenile sex offenders over the years. Normally the best behaved out of the bunch, and when I would happen upon their convictions it would always surprise me at how heinous some of their sex crimes were compared to how subdued and or polite they were when I knew them. The sad fact is that the overwhelming majority were in there for perpetrating the same abuse that they were simultaneously a victim to as well. Sad to see the circle of abuse and how it perpetuates itself. Same. I was a detention officer for a while, and I never looked too much into what the kids did, especially if they were well behaved. There was this one kid that was just great. Always helpful, and never caused problems. One night in the control room I mentioned to a co-worker how awesome this kid was helping close up the kitchen, and she says, "Have you seen what he's in for?" I had not. So she showed me that he was actually in for molesting his 18-month-old baby sister. I was 16 but tried as an adult, so they kept me in a 21 and under pod. Malvo, the DC sniper, was in my pod. Also, one of the first people I saw in a chain gang was Charles Manson's brother. Swastika on his forehead and everything. Lessons learned: don't be a fuck boy. Fuck boy. What did you do related to that got you tried as an adult? Technically armed robbery with a deadly weapon. But in reality it was me and 4 other friends who held up a store one of us worked at with a plastic gun. Still ridiculously stupid, and I deserve everything that came from it, but it really was the life-altering event I needed. Didn't help that Jay Leno and David Letterman made fun of us either on their shows either. Lol. I am 20, was in and out juvie from 15 to 18 till I went to county jail. The worst people I came into contact was a boy 15 who shot his stepmother, slit her throat, beat her head in with a blunt object, wrapped her in sheets for the father's roommate to find her, then he shot him. Happened in McMinnville, Oregon. Other than that, a lot of people raping siblings, and making threats to shoot up the high schools in the area. That's Yamhill County for you. Was in prison for 27 months. Unfortunately, your child rapists and kiddie porn guys were mixed into Gen Pop, so you would get all kinds like that everywhere. The worst one I heard of was when I was in military prison. Details are foggy because this was 13 years ago, but I remember there being a guy who got 99 years for murder. He had killed a guy, then killed the guy's wife because she was home and would have been a witness, but not before raping her first. The whole facility got locked down every time they moved this guy, because they didn't even want the other inmates to see what he looked like. The other fucked up one was at the same facility. So in the army there's a thing called turtle fucking, where you hit someone's Kevlar helmet with your Kevlar helmet. It makes a loud thonk sound, but doesn't really hurt. People didn't hit super hard, just hard enough to make the noise happen. This guy turtle fucked a girl when she wasn't wearing a Kevlar helmet. She ended up dying while the guy was still awaiting his trial, and he went full on cuckoo bananas. Before I got my prison sentence in 2013 I was in Arapahoe County Jail with James Holmes. Was pretty crazy cause they'd put the whole facility on lockdown to move him, even though he was in segregation. 12 life sentences plus an additional 3,318 years for that guy. Deserves it. I had a cellie in prison who was a KKK white boy. He was a madman. He was always pissed off and would say the craziest stuff like, "Did you hear that? The white rhino is going extinct. Fucking Jews." I was watching the movie about black pilots in World War II and he sat down indignant and rolled his eyes and guffawed. Black pilots? Come on. I said, "You really think there are no black pilots?" He said, "Hell no, have you ever seen a black pilot?" It was like this every day until my move finally got approved. Have you ever seen a black pilot? Isn't that the point of the movie? I was in a women's prison. New inmate told everyone she was in for tax fraud. Couple of days later, she gets the crap beaten out of her and doesn't leave her cell again. Food gets taken in by screws, and eventually she gets ghosted out. Turns out she was in our side and both her husband and son were in the male side for running a child porn ring. Those guys had been put straight in the VP wing, but most female prisons don't have enough sex offenders to have one. It was one of the screws who told some of the inmates why she was in. They wanted her to be taught a lesson. The offenses were awful. She was fully part of it and was responsible for acquiring a lot of the victims as she was trusted by people. Youngest victim was her niece's 3-month-old who had to be hospitalized due to trauma. Sorry to ask, but what's a screw? Prison officer. When I was in jail, my cellie was a guy that tied his old lady down to their table and tried to carve "Do Not Resuscitate" into her chest. Halfway through, the cops showed up because the neighbors could hear her screaming. I tried as politely as I could to tell the captain that I don't mess around with woman beaters and asked for a block transfer. Thankfully they put me in work release, which was awesome because I got to work in the kitchen and deliver food to the different blocks. No food hall meals were brought to you and you never left your block except to go to the basketball CT or the library. Well, one day I'm serving food to one of the solitary cells and as soon as the slot is opened a drenching wet magazine gets thrown out. Turns out it's covered in piss and the woman inside is the chick my previous cellie carved up. Turns out she stabbed her son with a syringe of her blood and she was inside too. Some crazy stories all around, but that couple far and away were the craziest people I saw. Poor son, getting jabbed with a syringe of his mother's blood. I can't even imagine what he put up with growing up. Dudes carving shit into your moms and then your mom injecting you with some blood. Fuck. Worked at a jail. A pregnant detainee didn't like one of her kids' baby daddies and so she abused the child, beating him with her BF with cable wires, starving the kid, and making him live in a closet in his own feces. Acted perfectly normal and agreeable. Didn't abuse the other kids allegedly. Evil mother. Hope she never sees another child in her entire life. Hope the little boy is loved now. The words "I shot that bitch in the stomach and I hope they both die" were used in reference to a 15-year-old pregnant girl. I won't ever be able to forget that one. My friend's dad was a volunteer chaplain, taking care of prisoners' religious needs, at the county jail. He came into our criminal justice class to talk about working at a jail. He told us that the most evil people at a jail are the ones that show no remorse for their actions. He saw the guy that killed the foreign exchange student that attended the University of Utah and he told us that the guy didn't seem to care at all. He was calm about everything. Kid in my history class shot up my school last year, killed 2 and injured 4. I remember when the cops got him, they got footage of him being taken into custody and a reporter asked him, "What did you do?" He just started laughing maniacally and goes, "I killed a couple kids." So fucked up. There was a guy I was locked up with in Baldwin County, Alabama who went into our common area library. Really just a bookshelf with about 50 to 60 books, and ripped out the last chapter of every single book. I wasn't an inmate, I was an officer, so my opinion might be disqualified. But at a facility I worked at we were a level 5, which is maximum security. Lots of people who had life without parole and just a bunch of different things happened. One guy was on a documentary because he traveled across several states and killed around 5 people total. He was pissed cause the documentary blamed him, but he always tried to say his father hitting him as a child made him kill these people. Then there's the old guy who raped his young grandchildren and was furious that he was sent to prison cause they were his grandkids so he could do whatever he wanted. He had also raped his children when they were growing up. Lots of sick things in a max security prison, and those would be nothing when compared to a federal supermax. There was also this dude in his 40s, this was when I was at the county jail, before being shipped off to state prison, who was a janitor at an elementary school. He was weird with a giant Star of David tattoo on his back and blonde highlights in his longish bowl-cut black hair. He sodomized 2 girls, 9 and 11, with a broom handle. I think his charge was sodomy with a foreign object. I remember everyone feeling contempt because we knew that in that county, sex offenders got off easy. Fortunately, we were wrong, he was given life. I remember the paper he got from court read. Release date, deceased. There was another chamo who raped his 3-year-old daughter, and when his wife caught him, she freaked out and called the police. He ran from the cops in a car and drove off a cliffside. Whether that was on purpose or not I'm not sure, but here is where it gets worse. So after the accident, he couldn't talk or act normal. He was essentially retarded, would shuffle around and rock back and forth anytime someone talked to him. Brain damage is what people said, from the car crash. People were nice to him until they found out his charge, then ignored him or were cold towards him, but he was retarded at this point, so no one went out of their way to harm him. This went on for maybe 7 or 8 months, but people started to say he was full of shit because gradually he started acting more normal, or people would catch him acting more normal than they believe he tried to portray himself. Eventually, it became obvious. He could not keep up the charade any longer, and everyone knew he was faking being retarded. People started fucking with him and tormenting him, people pissing on his laundry bag, trustees banging their brooms on the side of his cell wall to make him start going crazy and crying. He had a single cell in the corner. He was still trying to act like he was restarted but was slipping up and slacking at times, and it became obvious he was full of shit. The worst part is that he only got 4 years. 4 fucking years for raping his daughter. I got 6 years for robbing someone of their drugs. Anyways, when he got to state prison after being shipped from the county jail, he got beat real fucking bad. Word travels in the system. I think he spent the remainder of his time in isolation. Even the guards hated him and knew he was bullshitting. Hands down. So this lady was married. Husband cheated. Had a full-blown affair, ended up with a love child. Somewhere along the line the wife is babysitting the husband's illegitimate child. He comes home from work, sitting down to eat dinner, and asks her how is the baby? She says I don't know. You tell me? This bitch ended up killing the baby, cooking it, putting it in the food and fed it to him. She's doing 2 life sentences. This is in Arizona, by the way. Side note, she looks like the devil. Her eyes are literally black and she looks like she has no soul. It takes a lot to creep me out, but this lady's vibe is one of the darkest things I've ever felt in my entire life. Did you meet her, or is there a video/story about this? Sounds creepily interesting to see a person like that. I was on the same yard as her. There is only 1 women prison in Oz and only 2 max yards. We called her the Dragon. Not in prison, but I was an intern in a public defender's office over 10 years ago, and the one that stands out was a juvenile locked up for the 3rd time for raping kids aged 2 to 4. Kid was obese and clearly very damaged. This was a juvenile detention center that was often used as a babysitter by crackhead moms, accuse the kid of a crime and get them locked up for the weekend so they could go on a bender. He was serving a sentence. I was warned going in there that he could turn violent at the drop of a hat, and the attorney was nervous about bringing a young female in, but I insisted. Kid looks me straight in the eye and says, "Don't let me out, I will do it again. I can't stop." He was hunched over, dead eyes and completely serious. Heard a story that some inmates would put broken glass in their feces and throw it at CO's faces. So when they would wipe the stuff away from their eyes, the glass cuts them. Yup. They mix it with urine as well so as to make it a fine mist. Often it will be allowed to ferment for an extended period of time to make it as putrid as possible. It's called gassing, and it's became such a problem in American prisons that they made it a felony. Was in Spofford Juvenile Detention Center when I was 13, not a good age to be there at 4'9" plus 100 pounds, and I was one of 2 Caucasians in the entire place, so I mostly kept to myself. I did befriend a kid named Chris Whitehead who showed up with a freshly healed scar about 15 to 20 inches long in the shape of a C on the side of his head. He didn't talk much, but he ended up telling me how it happened when I finally got the nerve to ask him. Told me his older brother jumped him into the crypts, and since he cried during, he took a hot knife and burned it into his head for the disrespect. Then he had his little brother, the same age as me by the way, shoot the first person to cross the street in their neighborhood, who ended up being a young pregnant girl. How he only ended up at Spofford is beyond me, but it was disgusting to see such a nice kid end up there because of his older piece of shit brother. I remember when he went to court he was sure he'd be transferred, so he pissed all over his jumpsuit and stuffed it in the radiator, causing all of us in the semi-violent block to be moved upstairs with the actual violent criminals. I think the kid I'm referring to was only on mine because of his age. The staff members there gave everyone their permission to beat the living shit out of him when he came back, but he never did because he got transferred, thankfully, because his brother ended up there too and was fully on board with the beatdown his brother was going to receive. Really glad they shut down that place because they were running drugs and a prostitution ring on the female side, and the treatment of the kids there was disgusting to say the least. I was incarcerated with over 280 people doing life without parole. There were all kinds: stabbed a neighbor lady 150 plus times, shot a bully in the head in the school parking lot, beat a dude with a hammer, etc. There were two that stuck with me, the one where he looked me right in the eye and told me about shooting a guy with a shotgun to the chest, creeped me the F out. Weirdo that kidnapped and killed some girl in his basement was another. John Wayne Gacy actually designed the miniature golf course there. I've been to county a couple times for multiple DUIs years and years ago. Longest stay was 4 days. I had just arrived my first time of going to jail. Pretty frightening not really knowing the process. Where you were going, who you'd run into, etc. So my first stop was a holding tank awaiting transfer to a cell block with about 15 or so other guys. We all were just in there talking. Nothing crazy at all, but the dude next to me seemed to be in and out of the system a lot, so he had stories to tell. Anyway, we watched two COs walk with a handcuffed, light-skinned black dude, 6 foot, built, green eyes. I'm not gay, but dude looked like he should have been a model on the cover of GQ. The guy next to me that was telling stories stopped, mid-story, to recognize this guy. I had no idea, but GQ guy was headed to court. Storyteller guy tells us GQ guy was arrested for triple homicide. Lots and lots of time goes by as we're all waiting and waiting and waiting in this holding tank. Next thing we know, GQ guy comes walking back down the corridor, handcuffs, shackles, with 4 COs escorting him. Storyteller guy looks over at him and puts his arms up as they ask what happened. Death penalty, he yelled. My first couple hours in jail I witnessed a dead guy walking.